Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out on pre-Labor Day day. I'm Austin Grossman. I wrote a novel, Crooked, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about Richard Nixon and what he means. Here's my quick bio. I started out in the 90s writing video games and designing video games. Worked on Ultima Underworld. I worked on System Shock. Worked on Deus Ex, just doing the ones you recognize, not the failures. Worked on Epic Mickey, and then most recently the first Dishonored game and the second Dishonored game. I keep forgetting that's public with Arcane Studios. I went to grad school for English literature, which is very useful on the job market, it turned out. And I started writing novels. I wrote a first novel called Soon I'll Be Invincible, about a supervillain, which I published it at the age of 37. So I was not one of your little prodigies. And then I published a second novel called You, about working in the video game industry and what video games mean. And now I wrote this book about Richard Nixon. You'll notice the books are totally different from one another, which is what we call not building a brand in the book trade. So I'm gonna read a little bit from the beginning of the book, and then we'll talk about Nixon, and then I'll read a little bit from the end of the book. So this is chapter 1, and to set the scene, this is the night of the Watergate break-in. This is Nixon sitting around in the Oval Office, waiting to hear what's happening over at the Watergate Hotel. The Oval Office always smelled of cigarette smoke, of medical disinfectant, and a faint undercurrent of sage. I just hope no one ever puts the Great Seal under a black light. Near the end, we had to steam clean it after each new moon. The walls were a pale yellow, and on summer evenings like this, the flags hung limp like so much damp laundry. It's June 1972. There was nothing to do but wait, all night if I had to, looking out at the black Washington, D.C. sky and my own reflection in the window, an old man's reflection now. I couldn't help sweating in the June heat, my shirt and wool jacket sticking to my back. It was always remarked that I never took it off publicly. I don't like to come across as too informal. That, and there was some custom tailoring in there that it wouldn't do for people to see. A hidden pocket that held a small caliber revolver with a speed loader. Regular bullets, no silver-plated nonsense. My insurance policy, along with a vellum scroll held to my thin, pale old man's calf with a rubber band. Did I mention that the other half of this book is about a Lovecraftian supernatural conspiracy? Well, it is. This is my Lovecraft-Nixon mashup. I lit a cigarette. Pat would be asleep by now. No one awake but me and the security guards. Franklin D. Roosevelt built the modern version of the Oval Office in the 1930s. At this hour, it can feel like a time machine, going back to the barren swampland that once was here, square miles of muck and still black water. In November 1620, 500 miles to the north, 102 British settlers arrived and started dying. Half of them went almost immediately from diseases caught during the journey, coupled with no food and a killing winter. Only 4 adult women survived that first year in the Plymouth colony. Fugitive Protestant mystics, Tillys and Martins and Chiltons, they huddled together in half-built log halls, reading by firelight on the edge of a frozen continent next to a dark forest that stretched westward all the way to the Mississippi. They couldn't even bury their dead. Outside, the snow had fallen 6 feet deep, and there were moving shapes in the night. They were 53 people without a country, watching one another die until one of them, we will never know who, walked out into the darkness to do what none of the others would. The colony at Roanoke had died. Plymouth would live. I stubbed out the cigarette and took off my jacket. It was time for me to do my part. I closed the blinds, knelt down and pulled back the carpeting to reveal the greater seal of the office. I rolled up my left sleeve and cut twice with the dagger as prescribed to release the blood of the democratically elected, the duly sworn and consecrated. I began to chant. These were not the duties of the US presidency as I had once conceived of them. But really, ask yourself if everything in your life is the way they told you it would be. I speak the words, light the incense, and try to clear my mind, but it isn't easy. The first time I was here was with Eisenhower in 1953. He was a different kind of man than you find now, the last president to be born in the 19th century. He knew things almost nobody knows now. He remembered waking up at dawn to pray to ancient gods of small-town Texas. He told me a lot about the war, things that no one should ever know. He said that he wasn't afraid of the future, only the past. I put my jacket back on, thinking ahead to what would be in that room on the 8th floor of the Watergate Hotel. Chairs pushed to the walls, perhaps a dead man in a wool suit, seated in the lotus position in the exact center of the room. It would be freezing inside, outside the heat of a June night. Packing crates marked in Cyrillic letters, a scattering of black feathers. The Cubans would do their part. Afterwards, the cleanup and the set dressing, staging the next act. They'd be found and the police summoned. The team would be revealed as amateurish hired hands caught in the wrong place. The cover-up behind the cover-up. Liddy would do his comic turn as the loose cannon. History would take its turn, and my public life would begin to unravel. But I survived. I outlived the hippies. I outlived Elvis and Marlene Dietrich and the Soviet Union itself. It's been 20 years now since I was forced to stage my own death. The tiny silicon disk on the moon that bears my name is slowly gathering dust. I lived on to see myself become a laughingstock, a cartoon villain, that place in the August roll call of presidents where history pauses and snickers. This is the story of the great con game that was the late 20th century, of American history's worst presidency, of how I learned to lie. It is not history as you know it. Suffice it to say that there are at least 3 sides to this story, and I will be telling both of mine. I promise you I will show the same contempt for the historical record that it has shown for me. My name is Richard Milhouse Nixon. I swore an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. I was educated at Whittier College in Whittier, California, and I have seen the devil walk. And that is chapter 1. And I thought I would say a few words because the first interview question I ever encounter on this book is why I would choose to write about Richard Nixon, our uncanniest president. And there are several answers. He was, for one thing, he was our funniest president, I have to say. I like writing about Nixon. He's one of those people where if you put him in any context, he's still funny. In the grocery store, at the laundromat, he's always funny. I thought, what if he was a paranormal investigator? That was the best context I could possibly think of for a Richard Nixon character. So the book has two major elements. Well, it's split up a couple of ways. It's split between as accurate a staging of the historical record as I could do, and then a behind-the-scenes story, which, as I said, involves a supernatural conspiracy in a fairly H.P. Lovecraftian cosmos. Because again, what was the funnest thing I could do? I ask myself. Does this work? Oh, it does work. OK, that's Nixon. I couldn't tell, writing the book, I have to say, if people would actually know who Richard Nixon was. If you ever teach in a college, you realize that it's not clear always whether freshmen have a grasp of who Bill Clinton was. To say nothing of communism and the Soviet Union, I have to say. I was born in 1969, which is just in the dim past. Nixon was the president when I was born, maybe for some of you as well. He was one of the first public figures I was aware of. And that posed the question because when I was 5 years old, I was trying to make sense of what the adult world was like or what made sense and how it ran. And so I was aware of Richard Nixon, very, very vaguely as the top guy, right? He was #1 in the adult hierarchy of everything. But like I was also aware that he was a complete joke and that everybody hated him because he was 74, 75. And that began my journey of like into the conundrum of the grown-up world. And trying to make sense of it, this was a stumbling block that I've never quite gotten over, because what the hell was going on? So that was really why I dived into this, to figure out the conundrum or the secret of Nixon, which is in some way the secret of the adult world to me. Because we only see him through hindsight, right? He's almost a footnote at this point in history, and he's a joke, and he's a villain. But if you actually step back to see his life, you see how weirdly huge it was. He was born in 1913. He died in 1994, allegedly. He was this huge national figure from the late 1940s to the mid or early 1970s. He resigned in 1974. So he kind of spans and in some ways sort of authors the political life of the second half of the 20th century in America. Yeah, there he is, smiling about it. I think that's when he got elected to Congress. So I mean, he was in at the beginning of Cold War paranoia, right? That's him at the Alger Hiss trial, like one of the early high-profile trials for treason, for people for communist spying. He sort of got in at the beginning of the idea that our friends and neighbors could be communists and communist spies, and that put him on the national stage politically. At the beginning, he was a little bit of a non-starter, but you can see that he had this preternatural grasp of what the political culture would be, and then he's vice president under Eisenhower. So he spends 8 years in the White House during the 1950s. At the sort of heart of things, at the heart of the sort of golden age, the highway system, the beginnings of the culture of the Cold War, of the culture of brinksmanship and containment and craziness. Right, he's in at the death of Stalin. He's in at the hydrogen bomb and all the crazy rapid response stuff that gave us such lovely drama as we were growing up, waiting for the world to end. That's him at the Checker speech with his completely inscrutable wife. He was losing. He was going to get kicked off of the vice presidential ticket, and he just rented a half hour of primetime television and went on completely without a script and put his wife next to him and talked about his dog, Checkers. And today it's a joke, but in fact, it was an enormous political triumph. Pat is the other major character of the book, and if there's anybody we know less about their inner life in American history than Nixon, it is Pat Nixon, who was a complete mystery to this day. The only good anecdote I have about Pat is actually what an interviewer told me, because he had interviewed George McGovern after, and McGovern told this story of after he had lost the '72 election, and he was seated next to Pat Nixon at a dinner, right? And it was a little bit awkward. He had been completely trounced in the presidency, and at some point Pat turned to him and said, "You know he's crazy, right?" I can't vouch for that anecdote, but at least I'm not the one who made it up. At least somebody else did. Anyway, Nixon careers on. He's the heir apparent to the presidency in the 1960s. Of course, he comes up against John F. Kennedy, who he didn't see coming. He loses the popular vote by 100,000 votes. So one of the closest margins in history. And I'm just spelling out his weird dominance in everything. Of course, he was a political outcast after that. That's I think that's a still from the Kennedy debates. And I have to say, I think most modern presidents would avoid getting that still taken of them. But this was an earlier, much more spontaneous and era in political television. All right, there he is having a complete meltdown in 1963 after he loses the gubernatorial race. He has the brilliant idea of going off script in his concession speech and just completely trashing the political journalism of the time in a totally out of control way. One of the things I love about Nixon is that he's bizarre and he's clearly just barely holding it together the entire time he's in public, which is, again, one of the things that made him great to write about. But then he comes back, and in 1968 he wins the presidency, which is he's exactly a time-shifted Al Gore, as if 1968. In 2008, Gore had come back and just swept everything. He beat Ronald Reagan, he beat George Romney, he beat Nelson Rockefeller. Again, it's another complete enigma in political history that he was able to come back and do that. And this is the thing that people miss in hindsight, because everybody knows the post-1974 Nixon. Everybody knows the resignation and the disgrace. People forget that people absolutely loved Richard Nixon. He was a beloved figure. He grew up legitimately poor. He was a populist. He was a pragmatist, which is to say he had no moral center whatsoever. But they loved him. Oh, there's him. There's him bringing. That's Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. And here's another weird quality of him, which is that so much of what he did is what we got stuck with. I have to say, so much of what we have now, Nixon gave us. There, he also brought George Herbert Walker Bush. I mean, these guys were getting it anyway, but Nixon was the one who shook hands and welcomed them. He gave us the space shuttle. He pulled Roger Ailes out of obscurity in 1968, the founder of Fox News, and made him his media director. He sort of founded the hyper-scripted sort of symbiotic relationship between the Republican Party and a national news organization. He got that going. He gave us the space shuttle, for better or worse. I mean, when we did the Pluto flyby, it totally came out that we would have had it, a decade ago if it weren't for Richard Nixon. He's the kind of Forrest Gump of American politics. Like, once you look for him in that entire era, he's absolutely everywhere. And by 72, he's one of the most recognizable, members of our species on the entire planet, which is what makes it so bizarre that in a couple of years, people were going to realize that nobody ever had any idea who he was, right? He was this sort of cranky introvert. Almost nothing he said in public was in any way uncalculated, except when he completely lost his shit. Then after a moment, you could see it. Like, as far as I can tell, we can only tell two things about him. One was that he really, really hated people who went to Ivy League colleges. He hated what he saw as the New England aristocracy. He was from Orange County, and like I said, he was legit poor, which is one of the few things you can say for him. And he really wanted to be president. That's the other thing that we know about him. Like, if there any passion we can detect in his life, that's the one. And he clearly got in way over his head. He clearly could not handle whatever it was that was going on. I like to think of him as a kind of patron saint of imposter syndrome, because he was totally unfit for whatever it was he got himself doing. Because the crime itself, the Watergate break-in, made no sense whatsoever, right? He sent people, or sent people to send people, however far the chain goes, to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters and steal some papers. He got nothing for that. And he won the 72 election in a landslide regardless. He brought down his entire presidency for nothing. And for somebody who obviously had the ability to calculate politically, it's a profound piece of nonsense that, for me, it needed to be explained. What was going on in there? And for somebody who almost never sort of showed their hand in public, was there even a person in there as we sort of understand it? I wanted to show a short. No, that's him. Yes, that's him. That's Sad Nixon. He's doing his resignation, but he's fine. Honestly, there's absolutely no reason to feel sorry for Richard Nixon. Because he was, among other things, a horrible person, which is not how I wrote him. But I just wanted to make, to some degree, part of the challenge of this book was to vindicate Nixon. I came up with it roughly at peak Lincoln versus vampires, right? When that thing was a whole craze. And I thought to myself, well, that's not a hard trick. making Lincoln a big hero, right? What would be a hard trick? What would be the hardest trick with a president? Well, I mean, it would probably be Nixon. Not our worst president, but very, very close. I'm not going to go into Andrew Jackson. Let's not do that. Yes, now that's Nixon. That's a rare Nixon by himself moment, I have to say. And that's more how I think of him. Just this guy by himself trying to figure out what the hell is my next move, and profoundly isolated. Because if you're Richard Nixon, who exactly do you trust with all of your shit? All right, this is a very brief video clip, and I wonder if we can show this from 26 seconds out. This is the famous, I'm probably going to play this without audio. This is the famous I am not a crook moment, right? This is in 1973, I think. He's well into the impeachment proceedings, right? He's doing a press conference. He's actually standing in the hotel at Walt Disney World. And the Nixon-Disney World connection, I have to say, is by itself incredibly fascinating and gets some play in the book. Yeah, so if we can try to play this from about 20 seconds, this is where we get the money quote. Yes, all right, he's building up to it. I'm doing this silently for a reason. American people have got to know whether the president is a crook. He is not a crook. And right now, he just realized he said the worst thing he possibly can, and he folds his arms, and his body language, as you watch the fuller clip, just starts to go haywire. Because he knows he has committed the greatest, I think he knows immediately that he's committed one of the greatest political gaffes in history. Because again, he's totally improvising. He nearly always improvised. He would start when he's campaigning, he would start his campaign speech by someone would go and introduce him, and he would make people take away the podium just to show that he was speaking without notes, because he thought people cared about that, which I think is one of the few very touching moments, was that he thought people would like him because he had a good memory. So Nixon is in the center of all of this, and with his erratic paper. I wrote a novel to explain that, and the way I explained it was by inventing a Lovecraftian darkness to the Cold War that becomes a conspiracy that he discovers when he's investigating in Alger Hiss, and he just gets deeper and deeper into it, and he can never tell anybody, because one of the reasons is that a pact with elder gods is one of the keystones of America's national defense program in the Cold War, because I mean, if we would build the hydrogen bomb, we would make a pact with Yog-Sothoth. Like, there was just no question that we would do that if we had the chance, because it was so clear that we would have done anything. And once you catch hold of that idea, you kind of feel inevitably you have to start writing a secret history of the whole business. So the presidency isn't what you think it is. The Constitution isn't what you think it is. And then there's Nixon in the middle pretending that everything is fucking normal. He's pretending it to the American public. He's pretending it to his wife. The only people he can tell the truth to are a pair of KGB agents who he's not even supposed to know. But they become his best friends. So the second element of the novel is a character study, right? It's what's it like to have a terrible, terrible secret. And at the same time to be in the brightest spotlight any human being can be in. And it's my attempt to explain the darkness of Nixon and what it would be like if you were actually like a normal person to be in Nixon's position, and then to go through the horror, and then actually to live on through the humiliation. Because one of the starting points for this was, what is it like to be Nixon in 1975 or 1980? And you're still there, and everybody knows your face, everybody knows what you did. Everybody has laughed at you and is still laughing at you, and thanks to Saturday Night Live, is just going to keep laughing at you for basically forever. And the second, I'd like to thank Google Image Search for letting me put this presentation together about a half hour ago. Yeah, so that's the image I took of Nixon. Nixon by himself on the phone, like kind of shadowy, frantically trying to send some secret message to somebody. And in my imagination, what he's saying is, just get me the hell out of this. Whatever the hell I've done, I need help. So I decided to let him talk about it in his own voice. And so the second section is from, I think I said it in '83. So this is actually part of the sort of the coda, the political afterlife of Nixon. And he's going to one of his, and I made this part up, he's going to one of his first public speaking engagements since, I mean, it's well after Frost Nixon, but it's one of his first public speeches. And he's trying to sort of come back into political life because he thinks he can. He thinks he can. He came back in '68. He thinks he can not run for president, but be a sort of statesman. So he's going to speak. They led me in by a side entrance. It took me through quiet corridors to a steel door. I could hear the hum and chatter of the excited crowd as the mayor went in and gave them one last reminder of who they were about to see. And she told the story well. The Environmental Protection Agency, Title IX, peace in Vietnam, détente, the voyage to China, and then, as usual, a slight sort of faltering through the last bits, edging past the salient details like a man on a narrow ledge. And then, please welcome our 37th president, Richard Milhouse Nixon. I squared my shoulders and made my entrance, walked solemnly to the lectern. On the podium, there was a hush as I looked out at the 8th grade class of the Des Moines Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School. I saw Pat standing at the back of the gymnasium, watching it happen. I let the silence drop and settle, breathed in and leaned forward slightly to the microphone. And then, as I pronounced the first syllable, every non-adult person in the room began to yell at the top of his or her lungs. I was looking up into a solid wall of gyrating arms and bellowing faces and children screaming at me. I'd miscalculated. At first, I couldn't hear the individual words, but then I didn't need to, did I? Every single monstrous one of them was in the same identical pose, arms locked rigid overhead, second and third digit of each hand spread in an ecstasy of inspired mockery, shoulders hunched, shaking phantom jowls, all shouting the same thing, chanting it, saying it like I'd never said it. Not crook. I am not a 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 crook. Boys and girls, I began. It was like speaking into a high wind. I stood stranded on the podium, waiting for the deluge to recede. And if anything, it grew louder. I looked down at the cheap wood of the lectern. I remembered other, better lecterns. Boys and girls, I started again. It just kicked them into a higher gear. But I kept on. It's an honor to be here at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School. It's truly marvelous. I couldn't possibly be any happier. I never learned to do a Nixon voice, by the way. But the guy who does the audiobook kills it, I have to say. I was once just like you. I went to a small school in Yorba Linda, California, in a time long distance. But my hopes and dreams were the same as yours. I worked hard, and in 1946, I was elected to Congress. The sound was dying down a little. In 1948, I was catapulted to national. Tricky Dick, yelled a red-faced boy, and the cry was taken up, and mere anarchy was again loosed upon the gymnasium. The boy wore a T-shirt with the word Supertramp on it. What the hell did that mean? The principal hopped onto the stage and made as if to take over, but I waved her off. Down below, children ran left and right, and objects were thrown, and offenders were dragged from the room. It was the Chicago riots in miniature. They had Richard Nixon himself here, and they were going to make the most of it. It's all right, I told the principal. They're just having a little fun. It wasn't her fault. If I hadn't wanted to be mocked by young teenagers, I could have protected and defended the Constitution like I said I would. You know, boys and girls, I like a joke as much as the next man. I really do, I said politics. Politics is a tough business, and you don't get through it without a thick skin. It's not always easy. I ran for the vice president in '52 with Eisenhower. We had our own trouble with the communists in those days. Did 8th graders know who Eisenhower was? They had at least heard the word communist as a sort of socialist goblin. They were Reagan youth. We faced great challenges. Nation divided, Soviet Union, spies, nuclear missiles, the Cold War. I groped for words. What could I tell them? What did these kids know? I looked out into the blank, half-pubescent faces. They knew Reagan, that ignorant pretender. They didn't know Eisenhower or Stalin or me. For Christ's sake, I was president, I shouted into the microphone to a howl of feedback. In the back of the room, Pat winced and made a slight shushing motion with a pale and trembling hand. But I wasn't done. Who knew the truth now? No one but her and Kissinger. a creature so far from human as to scarcely matter, a being who might never die at all. I had to tell them the story. Your mothers and fathers voted to make me their supreme leader, the most venerated position an American can aspire to. Laugh if you want to, but believe it, you little shits. I was your fucking president. When had the crowd gone silent? I heard the last words ring 3 times through the gymnasium, like Peter denying Jesus. And all at once, I understood them. At their age, I didn't even know what a president was, really. It was just all the people of our country decided who was the best person in all of America. And that person got to make the decisions. And I, the boy they'd one day call Tricky Dick, wanted to be that person. God, I wanted it. I cannot tell a lie. I don't know why. I just did. So I knew why they were laughing. I'd taken the idea of the presidency and I'd turned it into a joke. And it's not that it wasn't funny, because whatever else I am history's funniest president. But these children were laughing at me to turn the thrust of a disappointment. They were laughing because I had hurt them in a very personal way. I was president the year they were born, the president their parents gave them. The best person in America turned out to be me, and they were still trying to laugh me off. After I signed the letter of resignation, Pat and I walked to a waiting helicopter, clutching our suitcases like newlyweds, and the concrete chambers beneath the White House were then sealed forever. I am the last chief executive ever to have seen them or practiced the vile sorceries to which they gave me access. I looked at Pat. She shook her head. No, leave it. The Cold War was a lie, and far beyond the Iron Curtain, the blacked-out science cities lay frozen and empty. There are truths so awful that they can't be told, and words so dense and alien and malign that they take 18.5 minutes to say, and even digital tape cannot reproduce their accursed sounds. The runes of the sealed chamber hold all these truths, last and least among them that once I had wanted to be president, defender of the republic, the true one that was promised long ago, holder of the highest office in all the land, even if I am a crook. So that's the end of Nixon. I can do a little Q&A or talking about Nixon. When I'm at a cocktail party and I mention I read about Nixon, anyone over a certain age, although they don't have to be, has something to say about Nixon. I have to say, it's weird. It brings something to the surface in a way I find entertaining and a little poignant. I forgot to say, I'm director of design at a company called Magic Leap, which Google put an enormous amount of money into, and that's a weird coincidence, and I can't say anything about it. But anyway, sorry, question.
So I was a senior in high school in 1994 when Nixon died. I remembered reading the obits, and I was just flabbergasted that he was set forth as this elder statesman that everybody should listen to and every new president took the counsel of. I'm just curious if you have any of your own insights into how he went from being a total laughingstock to having nice obits.
Yeah, no, everybody went to that funeral with like a totally straight face, right? Everybody acted super solemn. I just assume it was because the political culture just couldn't assimilate the facts of Nixon, and they just found it better to go into denial mode, right? They were trying to retrieve the presidency for themselves, right? Bill Clinton was there, gave a very touching talk. They just couldn't admit that Nixon had fucked it up for them. That's my theory there. They were just trying to hand-wave themselves through the whole matter. In the book, Nixon watches it on TV and he dies laughing practically. Yeah.
Sorry to change gears here, but I read Soon I Will Be Invincible last year, and I was curious to hear the origin story of that book, same as how you were describing how Crooked came about.
Oh, right, yeah. That is an origin story, as it were. Soon I'll Be Invincible is about what it's like to be a supervillain. Basically, what is it like to be Lex Luthor? What is it like on the inside? What is it like when you go home and have to make yourself breakfast in your secret fortress? I have to say, that was my first book. I wrote it when I was in grad school, when I was supposedly going to be an English professor. It's about a lot of things. It's probably about being a graduate student where everyone tells you how smart you are, and then they just totally step all over you, right? It's about just the infuriated feeling that you're incredibly smart, and the world is just laughing at you, right? And it was also about getting up in the morning and doing it again, right? Because any supervillain is like Wile E. Coyote, right? They come back and they think it's going to work this time. And I don't. That was for me an affirmation of the human spirit. And I mean, and also because no one was going to write. Well, at the time, no one was going to write Watchmen again, right? I just wanted to read more Watchmen, and I was going to have to write it myself if it was going to happen. And then of course they did, which is even sadder. Anyway, question. Hey.
Hello. This may ramble for a bit, sorry. One of the cool things about Nixon is that even those of us who grew up after the whole thing happened, there's still this culture from the time, from the 60s, from the 70s that refers to Nixon. It feels so alive today still to me. I love how you imagined his character and imagine you got inside his head in the book. I saw Stephen King recently at the Times, for some reason, slamming the book Our Gang, which I read and thoroughly enjoyed and thought was another fascinating way to get inside Nixon's head. Do you know Our Gang?
I know of it, but I didn't read it. It's one of those books where you're writing a book and you keep away from it because you don't want your imagination to become contaminated. But yeah, I know what it is. No, I didn't hear a question.
Yeah, I kind of rambled a little bit, didn't I?
No, it's
just kind
cool.
of thinking about how cool it is that all this culture still exists about Nixon from that time and how it seems like it's still alive and could be just kind of grabbed and accessed immediately.
No, I know. Well, I know, and I was wondering about that. Did people forget Nixon or not? But apparently they didn't. I mean, he's the American Lex Luthor. I don't know. There's something about this massive public fuck up that like people like to hang on to, I guess. Like you're never going to have a worse day, perhaps, than Nixon did. I guess, and I think maybe because people secretly think or know that all our presidents are crooks, right? But one of them admitted it, and it's a continuing relief. At least maybe that's how it is for me. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for being here. I might be standing too close. It's sort of a serendipitous moment hearing you talk about the book, and I hadn't heard about it until I started seeing the posters. My wife right now is reading One Man Against the World, which is a Tim Weiner book.
Yeah.
I was curious, sort of in specific, if you were aware of that book and sort of the timing, because it's pretty well timed for you, I would think.
Right.
And then also a lot of the stuff that's revealed in that book, I haven't read it. She's like, every night turning over like, did you know, one of these things. I mean, the amount of drinking Nixon was doing, those types of facts. I'm curious, were you aware of that? And then just in general, where else did you kind of take research from around some of the real meaty historical stuff? Right.
The more facts you read about Nixon, the more you realize that he didn't have any of the political discipline that a contemporary president has. He drank like crazy. He would drink and make crazy phone calls. If a modern president tried to do the things he did, he would have 5 advisors who would tackle him to stop him. I mean, the example is after Kent State, right? Like all these protesters are lined up on the Lincoln Memorial. Hippie kids are just camped there, and Nixon drinks until 4 a.m. and then he goes out in person onto the Lincoln Memorial to talk to them. He just walks across the lawn. Can you imagine a contemporary president just drunkenly mingling with the protesters and nobody they would hit him with a tranquilizer dart or something. They would just stop it. I mean, at least he was there are moments when you can detect a human being who is just willing to fuck up, again that's it's a little sad that we've lost that. I have to say. Anyway, it's weirdly the summer of Nixon. There were 2-3 books that came out, not even counting mine, and I'm not sure why that is, other than people who were born with Nixon are old enough to write books now.
They declassified a bunch of documents too.
Oh, there you go. Someone did research.
I think the lockdown after Reagan and Hinckley, I don't think they let the president. That's the other thing. They don't let the president do anything.
Right.
It seems to be.
No, that's a good point. It's weird to see change when Reagan came in, the more you look at it. Anyway, the book I read for this was called Nixon Agonistes by Gary Wills. And it's a terrible title, but I really think it's one of the most brilliant political pieces of political journalism I've ever seen. There's a great scene where he's on the plane with Nixon as he's campaigning, and he talks to Nixon, but like everyone's sleeping, so the lights are kind of out, and he talks to Nixon, and he's talking, and he can't see Nixon's face, and suddenly he realized when you're not staring at Nixon's face, like he becomes a totally different person because the hypnotic like jowls and nose sort of armature like just turns him into a character. But when you can't see his face, it feels much more like talking to a person. Anyway, it's a great book. It may be out of print. I'm not sure. I had to special order it. Anyway, I did a bunch of research, but I'm never going to be the guy who has the. I did like what felt like the right amount of research, so that I could then start making stuff up from there. I'll put it that way. Every once in a while, I deviated from the historical record here and there. The night of Watergate, Nixon was in the Bahamas, or his body double was. We don't know. And then I transferred some of the rides between Disney World and Disneyland, and actually the biggest pushback I've gotten is messing with some of the details of Disney World versus Disneyland. Make of that what you will. Did you know in the early 60s they wouldn't let Khrushchev into Disneyland? Like he wanted to go, and they were like, no, you can't. What were they hiding? Okay.
So in the book, some of the presidents know about the supernatural activities, and some of the other presidents have no idea, or they only suspect. How did you decide which presidents would be in the know and which ones would be ignorant?
Well, it came out weird. The idea is that at the founding of the Plymouth colonists, and then at the founding of the proper United States, it becomes a sort of magical pact with the native elder spirits of the continental United States. And there's and that certain powers and responsibilities devolve onto the president as a kind of intrinsic element to that contract. But that knowledge is lost. It's lost during the Civil War, and then Taft kind of semi-reconstructs it. But part of what happens to Nixon is Eisenhower knows the most about it of anybody during the 20th century. But in 57, Eisenhower has a stroke, and in the book he loses the knowledge. So Nixon was supposed to be briefed on what a sorcerer president does, but he doesn't know. He's left adrift. It works out for some reason that nearly all the presidents in the know are Republicans, and it was not on purpose. It just worked out that way. That the Republican lineage makes it is the dominant one. Although I will say it's not the ideological Republicans of today. Eisenhower was, and Nixon himself was virtually like completely distinct of the Reagan and post-Reagan Republicans. So to the point where he's more or less unrecognizable. But yes, it just ended up being the Republicans because it ended up being passed down within one party, and that ended up being the Republicans.
Hi, this is more of a cocktail party anecdote. So I moved into the States from Dominican Republic in '74. I was around 12, and I have to say it was a loss of innocence to realize that U.S. Politics, as perfectly portrayed in movies and so on, was just as corrupt as Dominican politics.
Oh, well said. But again, it was always corrupt. We just he just forced us to acknowledge it. I mean, Warren G. Harding was really the teapot dome scandal. I mean, Harding was really just as bad, if not worse. He just didn't have the charisma to get in trouble the way Nixon did. Is my only theory on that one. If there's nothing else, we can totally wrap up. I'm going to hang around and have lunch and all that. I'm happy to talk to people. Thank you guys for coming out in the middle of the day. This was great.